may not choose as good a package. We do about taxation. That's what I want to talk about. So finance follows function, follows governance. First, let's talk about the metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas, remember now, this is the whole area. This is a metropolitan government. Imagine Mumbai, where we could actually draw the boundaries of the labor market area. Think about that as a metropolitan government. Actually, with an area-wide base like that, they could deliver most services. They could deliver most social services, and they could deliver most infrastructure services. And they could finance it by imposing a regional tax. Why? Because the base is region-wide, and so they could. Where are you going to put that, my friend? You better take it back over there. Okay, you put it there. They could finance it with a regional tax. You could levy a regional payroll tax if you had a metropolitan area, and so it would be feasible to do that. If you were a functionally fragmented local government, the single-purpose special district, you could offer the single service for almost any utility on an area-wide basis, and it's being done all over the world for everything from subways to bus services to water utilities and so on. So you could offer almost any service of that kind, and the thing is, you wouldn't have to worry about the spatial externalities or the economies of scale, because for most services, we would capture those on an area-wide basis. So you could do that, one function at a time. And you could impose the financing with either a regional tax or with a regional levy of a user charge or a benefit charge. I think the Bogota transit system is financed on a regional basis with a regional sales tax. So that has some advantages. The disadvantage is it's probably one function at a time. Then there's the jurisdictionally fragmented local governments, the home rule model, where you have a great many municipalities operating within the metropolitan area. Well, that's certainly decentralization. I mean, that would make Professor Thibault smile if he were still alive today, that we would have many municipalities operating within the metropolitan area, offering different things to their constituents. But it would have some disadvantages. One would be that these small, fragmented local governments can't offer a lot of different services. It can't offer those that are characterized by significant spillovers, externalities, nor can it offer services where economies of scale are prominent. And so it drives these local governments to offer only services that are local benefit services, where the benefits are captured within the local areas. So they might be able to offer primary schools, health clinics, local road and street maintenance and such, but not the bigger services. That's a decided disadvantage. And in terms of financing, the jurisdictionally fragmented places, the most decentralized metropolitan areas, are the least able to finance the services. They're going to almost be forced into being dependent on intergovernmental transfers to finance. Why? Because they're too small to levy a regional tax. A single local government couldn't tax the entire region. And if it tried to tax only its constituents with, let's say, a sales tax, it may find itself exporting a significant amount of the burden away from its borders, which also is inefficient. And so so you'd find these local governments forced to use pretty much the property tax and user charges, and so a limited ability to finance. Now, so conclusion from all of this, if one of these students works it out in the right way, is that if we step back and look at this, we'd say that decentralization, the jurisdictional fragmentation model, probably isn't going to allow metropolitan areas to meet their service needs by levying broad-based taxes. And the story is that while we might be thrilled about the idea of decentralizing governance from the central government down, we might be a whole lot less thrilled about decentralizing governments within metropolitan areas. And that's a kind of a different conclusion than we've been talking about. Okay, last thing. Lower level governments, what would you do? First, you're the central government now, and you've got metropolitan structure the way you want it. Let's say you created a metropolitan structure, so you've made the externality problems go away. What do you have to do at the central level or at the state level? What if you're a state in India? How do you empower these local governments? Well, I've got eight recipes to talk about. The first one is you get the expenditure assignments right. One thing we know is that we want these local governments to do important things. I mean, it's part of it is to get government closer to people, isn't it? The other part of it is to provide services to people that they think are important. So if you decentralize, the maintenance of the cemeteries, it's not so as important as if you decentralize primary education. So you've got to decentralize important and appropriate functions. But you can't decentralize functions that don't fit a decentralized model. My winner in that violation is China, where pensions and national health insurance are financed by the third tier level of government. Would you believe that? I mean, that's a pretty unbelievable assignment of responsibility, and it screws up the system pretty badly and needs to be moved to a higher level. So the assignment has to be done right. Pull back on vertical programs. Boy, if I knew more about India, what I would say is, wouldn't Mumbai, somehow after it got through the shock, wouldn't Mumbai be a whole lot better without those parastatals operating within the metropolitan area? I don't know if that's a true answer or not, but in other places it could be. A third thing is the biggest flaw of all is that in developing countries, the central governments tend to be very paternal toward local governments. Father knows best. And father says, we don't think you're going to spend this money right. So we're going to decentralize, but we're going to tell you how to spend the money. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to impose significant mandates on you. We're going to impose significant regulations. And even in some countries, we're going to tell you directly how to do the work. And what happens is capacity to deliver the service. Fourth, all over the world, there's a need to decentralize responsibility for the wage bill at the local level. Don't think for a minute that India is the only country that has a wage commission. I mean, all over the world, there are cases where the national government decides on the wage increase of all public employees, decides in many cases how many can be hired, and even sets the civil service rules. So you have a kind of a crazy system where you have somebody sitting up here at the top deciding how the wage bill will rise, uncompensated, and down here at the bottom you've got the decentralized agencies that somehow will have to accommodate those sorts of increases. Bad idea if you believe in decentralization. So there's another example of how one would empower the locals. Authorize regional taxation. That's not done as often as we would imagine. The share of subnational governments in total taxation is pretty small around the world, probably with the exception of the middle income countries, is very small. Central governments, I think the standard arguments are that central governments are terribly afraid of the competition that would come with devolving taxation to the subnational governments, because there's only so much tax base. The other story is that if you someday will get around to reading Jorge Martinez's paper in the volume, you'll see that it argues that even when subnational governments have been given the power to levy broad-based taxes, they've structured the taxes in a very bad way, and it's been inefficient. Establish a realistic borrowing framework. You know, there's no reason to believe that the whole world is Brazil and Argentina and we're going to have big defaults if local governments borrow. What we learned from Brazil and Argentina is there was a combination of a very poor borrowing framework and a government that was unwilling to enforce the rules that were in place. And so you had irresponsible behavior by the local governments. But there has to be infrastructure finance, and borrowing is the way to do it. Redraw boundaries where they're necessary. How would you like to go sell that one to your constituency in a metropolitan area? We're going to redraw the boundaries so that your municipality is going to look different next week than it did before, huh? So let me tell you, the South Africans, after apartheid, when they came in and they restructured government and moved to their new form of government, they found out that they had 850 local governments, municipalities. And for a country 30 to 40 million people, that's too many. And many of them were small and inefficient. And so they went out and they redrew the boundaries of the whole country, and they changed the boundaries and reduced it to 250 municipalities. So, you know, if there's a will, boundaries can be changed. And why would we believe that boundaries should stay the same forever for even local jurisdictions? Make the grant system asymmetric. I mean, we don't want to get responsibility and much more taxing responsibility. And we're going to have an asymmetric grant system that discriminates against them, because the whole idea is that these guys should be self-financing. And so an asymmetric grant system makes a lot of sense and probably ought to be in the future of any country that's undergoing significant amount of urbanization. And we can point to a number where that's true. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Bahl, for that extremely clear discussion of the framework of decentralization and the extent that we can rely on, to what extent we should go on decentralization and the structures associated with it. May I request now, we're well within our time, so may I request Mr. Vasanth Rao, GM Finance, Bangalore Metro Rail Corporation, to be the first discussant, please. You have about maybe 10 to 12 minutes.
During the tea break after the first session, I was talking to Abe Pete, and I told him, will there be anything left for me to say after when my turn comes? My fears have come true. So I will just stick to a question whether decentralization